I really believe there are things nobody would see if I didn't photograph them.
Hello photography fans, welcome back to All About Street Photography channel. Today I'm going to talk about a photographer who is one of America's best known and also most controversial photographers. Also known as a photographer of freaks, let's talk about Diane Arbus. Diane was born as Diane Nemerov in 1923 in New York to Jewish parents who were immigrants from Soviet Russia. They were actually pretty rich as they owned Russex, which was a department store on Fifth Avenue. Thanks to that, she was not affected by the Great Depression. However, being a kid in a wealthy family meant she was mostly raised by maids. It was perhaps the environment she lived in that she kind of separated herself from the family. Even though her parents didn't directly raise her, they had an indirect influence on her life. After her father retired, he became a painter, her sister became a designer and sculptor, and her brother a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. Diane herself started painting but quit just after she finished high school. Perhaps missing the family bonds, she married very young, at the age of 18, to Diane Arbus. They both worked in a commercial photography business for a while from 1946 to 1956. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't work out and they got divorced in 1969. Her husband left and became an actor. You might actually remember him from the TV series MASH, where he played Dr. Sidney Friedman. I actually recognize him and I'm not even from the US, so I guess you might recognize him as well. But it's not her personal life that I want to talk about today. So let's check out her photography career. Arbus received her first camera just after she married at the age of 18. Her husband was actually a photographer for the US Army Signal Corps in the Second World War. She started taking photography classes with Bernice Abbott, a photographer best known for her portraits. In 1946, they started together Diane and Diane Arbus, which was a commercial photography business where she would have a role of art director. She was responsible for concepts and models, which wasn't really a dream come true for her as she saw her position as very unfulfilling. Even though Diane and Alan both didn't particularly like fashion photography, the business produced photographs for Russex advertisements and also for fashion magazines such as Vogue, Glamour or 17. In the second half of 50s, Diane began more and more focusing mainly on her own work. But other than that, we can say they were pretty successful. A photograph that they made for the Vogue magazine, a father and son reading a newspaper, was included in the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition The Family of Men in 1955. When we look at her solo photography, one of the earliest images she took is this photograph, 42nd Street Movie Theater audience, New York City in 1958, which captures a number of people sitting underneath a flat projector light. Now, what we can take from this is she was probably quite shy at the beginning, shooting from places where she could not be seen, avoiding the human interactions. At first, Arbus admired the grainy look the camera and film were able to produce. Her camera of choice was first Nikon with 35mm lens that she used for photography in New York City. Sometimes around 1962 she switched to twin lens reflex Rolleiflex camera. The medium format camera came to be one of Arbus's compositional signatures. She explained this transition saying, "In the beginning of photographing, I used to make very grainy things. I would be fascinated by what the grain did because it would make a kind of tapestry of all these little dots. But when I would be working for a while with all these dots, I suddenly wanted terribly to get through there. I wanted to see the real differences between things. I began to get terribly hyped on clarity." She first started what we can now call her own version of street photography. One of the important mentors in her career was Lisette Model, an Austrian-born photographer mostly known for her street photography. She later said Arbus came to her telling her she cannot photograph. "I want to photograph what is evil," she said. She was determined to reveal what others had been taught to turn their backs on. The scheme typical for her photography is a frontal portrait in square format. She was one of the pioneers of daylight flash use, which she used to isolate her subjects. What she first liked about it was how it alters light and reveals things you don't normally see. The reason for that was, as she said, she wanted to have stillness in her photographs, and that is why she always posed her subjects either on the street or in their homes. She made the subjects look directly to the camera to freeze the pictures. However, as we can see in many of her pictures, the effect was quite opposite, as many of her pictures look spontaneous. Other than that, she also said she liked to keep the subject as it was and rather rearrange herself. The Child with a Toy Hand Grenade in Central Park, New York City, 1962 is probably one of her most famous photographs. The image is unusual and I would say a little disturbing. I mean, seeing a kid who is kind of tense and angry in a pose with his teeth clenched and holding a hand grenade in one hand and the second hand in a shape of claw-like gesture is a bit unusual, I would say. Standing alone makes him isolated from the others in the park. It is considered to be one of the most important and influential images of 20th century art and postmodernism art theory. When we look at the contact sheets, we can see she took plenty of normal photographs of the kid in the park smiling and playing around. However, when it came to picking the final image, she chose the most expressive one. The boy in the photograph is Colin Wood, and he later said, "She catches me in a moment of exasperation. It's true, I was exasperated. My parents had divorced and there was a general feeling of loneliness, a sense of being abandoned. I was just exploding. She saw that and it's like commiseration. She captured the loneliness of everyone. It's all people who want to connect but don't know how to connect. And I think that's how she felt about herself. She felt damaged and she hoped that by wallowing in that feeling through photography, she could transcend herself." Now, what's interesting is that more than shooting random subjects she met on the street, she was often trying to develop personal relationship with the subjects and photograph them over time. She started to photograph much differently than what was common until then. The intention behind it was to be original and unique. A Very Young Baby in New York City in 1968 is a photograph of Anderson Cooper, CNN correspondent and son of Gloria Vanderbilt. It was one of the photographs Arbus took for Harper's Bazaar in 1968. She knew the parents, so she asked about coming over and spending some time photographing the newly born baby. She kept coming for about 3 weeks and apparently took a lot of pictures. She finally picked this one. Cooper himself doesn't find it disturbing. The photographs from Arbus are in his room hanging up with Diane's note. The Jewish Giant at Home with His Parents in the Bronx, New York, 1970 is a photograph of Eddie Carmel standing in his parents' living room. It is an archetype of Arbus' photographs. As a teen, even though Carmel was normal height during his childhood, he started to grow uncontrollably as a result of acromegaly. He grew to be 8.9 or 270 centimeters. The photo looks like a preparation for the family portrait. For me, the vignetting intensifies his size and the voyeuristic feel from the photograph, just like sneaking in someone's home and watching them through the keyhole. Unfortunately, he died at the age of 36 just 2 years after Arbus took this photograph. Arbus believed she got what she called every mother's nightmare. She said, "You know how every mother has a nightmare when she's pregnant and her baby will be born a monster? I think I got that in the mother's face as she glares up at Eddie thinking, oh my god, no." One of my favorite shots is the girl in her circus costume. Somehow, I just can't avoid the comparison of the Wonder Woman from the Marvel Universe, and for me this photo is a representation of the 70s and how they probably portray the subject at that time. The subjects she photographed were often people with troubled lives, people from underground, or just people who were not accepted or, let's say, respected by the rest of society. She often sympathized with them, probably because it was something she wasn't able to experience in her life. We can say the subjects had completely different backgrounds than she had. She would shoot strippers, carnival performers, transvestites, members of LGBT community, nudists, or people with mental disabilities. She said the subjects in her pictures were more important for her than the picture itself. Photographer Edmund Shea said about her, "Some people like to think of her as cynical. That's a total misconception. She was very emotionally open. She was very intense and direct, and people related to that. Perhaps the most valuable thing for her was not the photograph, but the event of visiting someone and the process of making the photographs. I wouldn't say she was redefining beauty, but perhaps showing the space between how people wanted to be seen and how they were actually seen." When we want to learn about how influential she was, I think it is best to use the words of art critic Robert Hughes. Arbus's work has had such an influence on other photographers that it's already hard to remember how original it was. She was twice awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, first in 1963 for a project called American Rights, Manners and Customs, and then again in 1966. During the 60s, Arbus worked for magazines but also took all kinds of commissions such as documentary photographs or family portraits. She had to do it since it was pretty difficult at that time to make a living just by selling fine art photography. Even though she was a recognized artist, her prints usually sold for $100 or less. As she became more and more recognized as an artist, she took less magazine assignments, and she also taught photography in New York City and Rhode Island. She was the first photographer to be featured in the Art Forum, which is an international magazine focusing on contemporary art. She had her first big exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in the New Documents in 1967, which was a documentary photography exhibition curated by John Sarkovsky. 32 of her photographs were chosen for the exhibition that represented a new direction in photography, ordinary subjects with a snapshot-like look. The exhibition presented works of 3 photographers, Diane Arbus, Gary Winogrand, and Lee Freelander. None of them was actually well known at that time. Unfortunately, just like her mother, Arbus suffered from depression as well as hepatitis. She experienced mood swings, and her then ex-husband even talked about violent changes of mood. It escalated in 1971 when Arbus committed suicide. She was only 48 years old. Today her works are held in collections of Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles County Museum of Art, among others. That is all for this short introduction of Diane Arbus. Let me know what is your favorite picture of hers. Also, feel free to suggest other interesting photographers you like in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.